Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the AIA Archaeology Hour for February in 2025. I'm Elisha Dumser, and I will be your host for this evening's talk. I'm a professor of art at the University of Akron in Northeast Ohio, and Akron is a small town with its roots in the rubber and tire industry. We have some rich cultural contributions, everything from being the site of Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech to spawning the music of Devo. So there's a little bit of everything here in Akron. I've been asked tonight, before we get started, to say a few words about archaeology at the University of Akron. And that's a surprisingly difficult task at the moment because, like many schools, our school, as a regional state university, is under tremendous budgetary pressures. And our administration has proposed shuttering our anthropology department and eliminating our archaeology program as part of the solution. Not only would this have an obvious detrimental impact on our students, but that impact extends into the greater Akron community and to the history that archaeology helps us create about our region. My colleagues not only run projects all around the globe, in Greece, in Turkey, in Kurdistan, not only do they write award-winning books, such as the 2019 Holton Award winner on Ziyaret Tepe, exploring the Anatolian frontier of the Assyrian Empire, but we also run projects that involve students and community members in archaeology. We've excavated at a 19th century farmstead. We've looked into a cemetery turned into a park in the city of Akron. And there are a number of Native American sites in the Summit County Metro Parks that we explore with our students as they learn how to become archaeologists and cultural resource managers. Shuttering our department would imperil these activities, but we're not the only university facing this kind of trouble right now. So, what can you do to help? The number one answer is to be involved. You're already interested in archaeology. You wouldn't be attending a lecture like this one tonight if you weren't. And so please, if you're fortunate enough to live somewhere where there's a local society of the AIA, attend and participate in their activities, be they in-person lectures on a college campus, maybe a movie night for the anthropology students, or an archaeology fair. When you're there, not only is it a tremendous amount of fun and you're supporting archaeology in your community, but your presence demonstrates how important you consider archaeology to be and how important it is to have that history that archaeology can teach us about our places written. So please support community-based archaeology and the next generation of archaeologists in whatever ways you can. One of those ways is by supporting the AIA. It's North America's largest and oldest archaeological organization. There are nearly 200,000 members worldwide. And if you're not one of them yet, please consider joining. Archaeology magazine is one of the publications from the AIA geared toward a general audience. If you'd like more technical reports, the American Journal of Archaeology is our professional journal. In addition to attending events from local societies, you can also learn how to excavate at excavations, and we maintain at the AIA an extensive list of fieldwork opportunities. You can visit archaeological sites with expert guides through AIA tours. So please consider using the QR code or going to our website if you've not yet become a member of the AIA. It's important to support archaeology, and your membership lets the AIA do the advocacy work that needs to be done. If you do join the AIA, you get all kinds of member benefits, including subscriptions to archaeology, opportunities to attend our annual professional meetings. You get an affiliation with a local AIA society and other benefits that you can see listed out here on the slide. The AIA is a nonprofit organization, and we rely on the generosity of donors to support our mission. Your gift makes archaeological research, site preservation, publications, and all of our programming possible. As part of that programming, we've had a number of archaeology hours in the 24-25 lecture season. Tonight will be Zainab Bahrani's talk. We have two more in 2025 on the schedule, one in March by Rosemary Joyce and another in April by Mark Aldendorfer. A couple of reminders as we get started. Please do not record this on your own device. The AIA will record this meeting and post it on their YouTube channel. So if you're interested in it and you know that someone else would be, you can send them that link after the talk. Finally, to repeat the Zoom setting tips that we had on the screen at the beginning, here are your tips about how to use the closed captioning and how to mute the chat pop-ups if you don't enjoy having them appear in the slides during the lecture. If you have a question during the talk, please type your question into the separate Q&A box that you'll see on your screen. We are going to try to get to as many questions as possible. If you put them in the chat, we may not see them. So please use the separate Q&A box. So here is your advertisement for Rosemary Joyce. Upcoming, her talk will be A Complex Society Without Rulers. Tonight, our lecturer is Zainab Bahrani from Columbia University. She's presenting Towards an Archaeology of Preservation. Professor Bahrani is the Edith Parada Professor of Art History and Archaeology and the Chair of the Department of Art History at Columbia University. She writes on ancient art and philosophical aesthetics, the history and politics of archaeology, on collecting, and on the modernist and contemporary art and architecture of Iraq. She has also published widely on the destruction of historical heritage in war and occupation. Professor Bahrani directs the Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments project to document and conserve historical architecture and rock reliefs in Iraqi Kurdistan, northern Iraq, and southeastern Turkey. Since 2019, she has been the director of the Bahadien Mosul Gate Conservation Project in Amadia in Iraqi Kurdistan. Professor Bahrani's distinctions include election to the Slade Professorship at Oxford, awards from the Getty Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, a 2003 Guggenheim Award, a 2019 Carnegie Award, and in 2020, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's the author of numerous books on the ancient Near East, including Women of Babylon, Gender and Representation in Mesopotamia, The Graven Image, Representation in Babylonia and Assyria, Rituals of War, The Infinite Image, Art Time, and the Aesthetic Dimension in Antiquity. Most recently, and probably of greatest interest to a general audience, is her Thames and Hudson publication, Mesopotamia, Art and Architecture. Upcoming this year will be war essays, but tonight, Professor Bahrani will present Towards an Archaeology of Preservation. So I'll turn the screen over to Professor Bahrani.
Thank you. Thank you, Alicia, so much for this introduction. And thank you for reminding us, especially about the importance of archaeology. Can you see my screen? I'm trying to share.
Not yet. Perfect.
Thank you for reminding us of the importance of archaeology, of the humanities and social sciences in general, as so many universities and colleges are having similar experiences to yours. So I appreciate that you brought that up. Thank you for reminding us. So today I would like to take the opportunity to present to you some of the field work that my team and I have been doing in Iraqi Kurdistan. But rather than keeping to the standard format of archaeological description, I would like to speak to you about the kind of intellectual work that can emerge from such projects, which can contribute towards a larger task of decolonizing histories and practices of archaeology. Our work in Kurdistan, in Turkey, and in northern Iraq over the last 12 years is a countermapping that re-envisions ways of telling the deep and multi-layered history of the region. This evening, I'll focus on the site of Amedi. It's pronounced Amadia in the local dialect and Al-Amadia in Arabic. We took up this site for preservation in collaboration with the Kurdistan Archaeology Organization and the Directorate of Antiquities of Duhok, which is also in Kurdistan. I'll present Amedi not only to recount our technical work there, but as a site to think with, as Claude Lévi-Strauss might say, about the intersection of fieldwork, landscape, archives, and the writing of history. Amadia is not an archaeological tell or mound, but the site of strikingly visible antiquities among which people go about their daily lives. Entanglement and encounters with antiquities forming the habitus of lived experience and one's sense of place in the world. Reflections on ruins and practices of architectural preservation have long been characterized as distinctive preoccupations of modern Europe. However, archaeologists are increasingly contesting this view. In more recent years, as a result of extensive archival research and the reading of colonial archives against the grain, alternative or indigenous archaeologies and earlier forms of relationships to the past have begun to receive more serious scholarly attention as a way to challenge top-down histories that are written from the perspective of state or imperial archives, and so result in a limited orbit of knowledge. Towards this effort, we turn to the archive within the field, the landscape of tells and ruins and of historical architecture across Iraq and Turkey, where I work. These reveal long-term, tangible evidence of historical preservation and conservation practices that my team and I have been studying. The work of architectural preservation and its intersection with archaeological methods can become a place to open new directions of thinking beyond earlier colonial narratives that remain in place, having themselves become a form of deposit into the land. The archive within the landscape can both augment and substantiate the archival and theoretical work of decolonization, turning archaeology against the grain, so to speak. So in envisioning the Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments project that I initiated in 2012, I wanted to not simply catalog or inventory sites and buildings, but to study the landscape close up and in the longue durée. Current perceptual modalities and methods don't generally allow for this kind of intimate process of walking, of looking, and reflecting upon these processes as one goes. So I want to speak about the intellectual methods alongside the technical methods of this work. These include this insistence on the longue durée that I mentioned, on the physical and the material context of historical monuments in wider landscapes and environments, and the lived and embodied experience of being there within heights and depths, the sense of the infinite and the time of the mountains. I will turn now to Amadia. It's an acropolis high up in the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan. close to the modern border with Turkey. It stands between the peaks of the Metin and Gara mountains, commanding spectacular views over opulent orchards of pomegranate and fig trees and agricultural fields below. Historically, it's best known as the seat of the Bahdinan Emirate, a Kurdish principality that flourished under the Ottoman Empire. A monumental stone portal gives entry into the city from the direction of the road to Mosul. Carved with a mythical scene above the arch, the portal, its sculpture, and its context are remarkable for several reasons. Amadia is a city that utilizes the natural defenses of the cliffs. In the 13th century, there were only two entrances through the city gates. One was known as the Mosul Gate, and now also called the Badinan Gate, and the second was the Zibari Gate, which is now destroyed. It was destroyed in the 20th century. And on the lower left, you can see that I've superimposed an old end of 19th century photograph upon the place that was destroyed, or I should say one of my team members did, to be more clear about that, to be more honest about it. So our own work has focused on the first gate and surroundings. The gate is reached by a rather steep and winding ascent from the valley. After a sharp turning, the paved path of ancient steps leads to the portal. Here we see the gate of limestone blocks bordered by a rectangular inscription frame in Arabic. About halfway up, an inner frame is formed by a linear band that at the springing of the arch winds itself into an angular voussoir pattern. A sunburst, a solar disk with facial features, surrounded by a double nimbus of rays and circled by a band of spirals, is placed above the keystone. Below is a rosette. In the spandrels of the arch, on right and left, we see long-haired and bearded heroes battling winged dragons with goat-like foreparts and serpentine tails. The heroes are richly dressed in slightly differing costumes of tunics and trousers, one with a longer coat embroidered with stars, so that despite the seemingly heraldic symmetry, they're not exact mirror images of one another. Upon closer inspection, we see that the winged goats are dragons whose long tails extend and merge into the spiral design, becoming part of the framing of the scene, so that the whole frame is composed out of the tails of the dragons. The heroes step upon the ground line created by the dragon's tails. At the same time, the ground line also seems to come out of the branches below, from which the background foliage that fills the spaces in between also emerges. Sometime in the later 1960s or the start of the 1970s, the gate collapsed, leaving only the left column of blocks standing in place at the east side. It was then restored in the 1980s, but pieces were put in the wrong locations. In 1997, more restorations filled in gaps and plastered surfaces of the relief. The flawed restorations were confusing, especially for seeing the complex iconography. As we began our own work to take down and reconstruct this jumbled restoration, we turned to historical research and archives. The German archaeologist Walter Bachmann was there just before the breakout of the First World War, and in 1911 he photographed the gate and the rock reliefs next to it. We were able to locate his original photographs in the archives in Berlin. One of these images was of such high quality, the one on the left, it was of such high quality that we were able to use it as a guideline for restoring the relief blocks to their original locations. We also located archival materials and historical photographs in Baghdad that guided our work. We combine this archival research with constant conversations with the community. We talk to elders living in the town for stories of the gate, the event of its collapse, and the sequence of restoration that they witnessed. In the process, we heard many stories about war and histories of violence, and also memories and stories of the gate itself. The closest parallel to our portal is a gate near Sinjar in Iraq, dated by inscription to Badruddin Lu'lu', who ruled in the 13th century. There we see heroes slaying similar dragons, though the tales have more knots and twists. Talismanic gates and dragons are not unusual in this Seljuk period, including in Baghdad and Mosul, but also in places like Aleppo and Konya. When the gate collapsed in the late 20th century, there was little documentation to work with. The haphazard restorations of the 1980s and 90s have often been criticized, but as we continued to work here, I gained new respect for our predecessors. They had no earlier architectural plans, drawings, or photographic documentation to guide their work. If they had not built the fallen blocks back into the arch, however haphazardly, the original blocks would have been lost. So the gate itself became a repository for the original materials that were preserved for us by the earlier restorations. And we were soon to find several more restorations from earlier times. Although the settlement is probably far older, the archaeological evidence on site dates to the Parthian dynasty. That is 247 BC to 227 AD. The Parthians are known for battles against Roman incursions, the Romans' incursions into Mesopotamia, and Parthian remains are found throughout Iraq in both north and south. By the Middle Ages, Islamic scholars wrote about Amadia, describing it as an ancient site and telling us that the name Amadia in Arabic is after Prince Imad ad-Din Zengi, who reigned in the 12th century. However, according to Arabic authors, the citadel was not a new city. It was built upon an earlier Kurdish fortification called Ashib, according to these medieval writers. What is interesting about this remark is that the name Ashib is in fact an ancient Akkadian word for dwelling or town or residential seat of power. It indicates that settlement here goes back to antiquity, so that the name in the medieval Arabic sources indicates the existence of a settlement that predates the visible archaeological evidence that we have seen. We can thus conclude that we lose a great deal of information by separating research into Islamic and pre-Islamic history. Archaeologists have not been aware of the name Ashib because they don't read Islamic history, and Islamic historians have little familiarity with Akkadian, so didn't see its significance. The disciplinary divide is part of a larger ideological division and research paradigm in which coloniality remains in the dissociation of Mesopotamian antiquity from the land and the people, with its historical narrative usually directed elsewhere. Yet the continuous presence of ruins and monuments is clear to us. So both Arabic historical evidence of the 13th century and archaeological evidence on site reveals that there was an ancient town here predating Prince Imad ad-Din. The rock reliefs at the entrance of the citadel date to the 1st century. At that time, our site was part of the kingdom of Adiabene within the Parthian sphere of influence. After 224 AD, it became part of the Sasanian Empire. And after Imad ad-Din's time, the entrance was rebuilt with the sculpture that we worked on. The visible gate inscription we see here is of Prince Bedreddin Lutlu, who reigned 1225 to 1259 AD. The inscription is in the outer frame of the gate for those of you who can see it. Ours was an extremely sensitive and challenging restoration project for several reasons. The main problem was that the gate had collapsed, but this was not just a matter of jumbled iconography that needed to be rearranged. Most of the structure had fallen, though the east side remained standing. I think you can see that in the upper right photo. It had been restored with pieces in the wrong locations, and odd new pieces were inserted here and there to hold it in place. But there was also a sheer crack in the east side of the gate that threatened to collapse the entire structure, with the only ancient wall that remained in its original place now in danger of collapse also. So to start, after thorough documentation, we found our sculptors and an elderly stonemason. They were able to follow traditional methods of work in stone. From the stonemasons in particular, we all learned a great deal about the stone, the methods of stone cutting and the carving, and the traditional tools that are still in use, as well as quarrying, the production of mortar, and building techniques. These are aspects of our project that became part of a larger study of histories of technologies, materials and methods, working traditions, and lifespans of sites. These methods and techniques are not to be found in texts, but are passed down among skilled workers, some of whom were apprenticed since childhood with their elders. So this knowledge is not written or archived, but learned through practice. As I watched and learned from the stonemasons, it became clear that this practice was often a silent instruction that involved rhythmic repetition of movement, often in pairs. It was an embodied knowledge, learned and passed down from one generation to the next, along with stories and tales of stone, the power of stone and stonework, architectural construction, and traditions associated with it. At the same time, our archival research in the archives of the State Board of Antiquities and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad and at the museum in Berlin allowed us to find historical photographs that became a visual guide for our work. I also reached out to friends and colleagues who had visited Amadia right before the first Gulf War of 1991 for their photos. And then we began to chart the different stages and states of the restorations of the gate. Two geologists from the University of Mosul joined us for the testing and analysis of stones and identifying the right stone quarry. After some searching in the area, we were able to identify Geli Darash. Then came the slow and careful removal of the gate blocks. We created a pulley and rail system with chain hoists using repurposed materials. We continuously experimented with recipes for binder and fill, using local methods and materials. The traditional mortars are created from the environment, sometimes mixtures of the natural earth or rocky limestone outcrop, but also parts of discarded blocks of stone. As we conducted our work of dismantling, we soon found that there were much earlier repairs of the Ottoman era inside our gate. Iron pins had been used to strengthen and hold together blocks precisely in the same location that we found to be weakened. So before us, people had contended with the same issues hundreds of years before. We had already noted that a wooden shim had been inserted in between some blocks at the east side at some point, and we noted that it is already visible in the 1911 photograph. The gate itself was a repository of a history of preservation. We erected a scaffolding using repurposed materials, repurposed beams from the industrial zone outside the Hook. Then we discovered that we had inadvertently purchased an old and repurposed German and Carnegie steel railroad beams, plural, that had been used for the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad before the First World War, and they were in constant circulation and reuse in Iraq for well over a century, and we bought them completely accidentally. This was a happy discovery because I had just received a major grant from the Carnegie Foundation. And here was the Carnegie steel beam, still completely good and usable. Of course, much of the bricolage, as we call it in art historical talk, much of this bricolage I had just the repurposing and the reuse that I'm talking about is actually typical of Iraq, of the entire country, because of the decades of economic embargo and wars that cut it off from the world. But the creative reuse and bricolage has also become a method of its own, from which we can learn about earlier forms of repurposing and reuse. In dismantling the frieze, we uncovered the large area of loose rubble masonry on the inside of the gate also, which had been the biggest cause of destabilization for some time. In the process of dismantling, we also found a missing dragon's head block buried within the rubble masonry wall inside. So we took it out and cleaned it, and we put it back in its original place. As for the larger site context, 3 ancient rock reliefs are distributed along the ascent towards the gate. The pathway, which was part of our 2013 mapping study, is clearly an ancient one dating to the Parthian period. As you climb up the path from the valley, you encounter a rock relief of a man standing in profile. This is the first relief you see when climbing upward from the valley, and after making a 90-degree turn, you see this. The relief is placed in a niche and is 2.21 meters tall, so that's over 7 feet in height. Although the surface is worn, what we see here is a striding man facing towards the direction of the gate. Before him, he has something in his upraised arm and that he holds out in front of him. And he seems to wear a fitted cuirass and a short kilt, and he carries a spear. So he's clearly some kind of a warrior figure or a princely figure in warrior gear. On his head, he wears some sort of a band or fillet, indicating his rank. Walking up the path and right before our gate, one sees the largest of the 3 rock reliefs, and this one is over 9 feet tall. We see a frontally positioned male figure in a somewhat contrapposto position. He holds a large standard or staff in his right hand. He holds his hand upwards. At his left, 2 different swords are hanging. He has thick curly hair and wears a fillet or ribbon with flowing ribbons on the left side of his head. Every day, farmers go up and down this path to the valley and come back up with their produce carried up by donkeys. Every day they climb up and climb down with these reliefs at their side. We studied the reliefs with a range of methods and technologies and cleaned and treated their surfaces. We also mapped, cleaned, and stabilized the ancient stairs that they use every day, and that also dates to the Parthian period. So at 2,000 years old, this stairway is perhaps the oldest monumental stairway in the region. Our study of the rock relief surfaces indicates that the reliefs were not effaced or deliberately damaged, but eroded with time. The Islamic era gate and fortifications were constructed without any attempt to remove the reliefs. Not only did the architects leave the reliefs in place, they were also guided by the reliefs to follow the original path. They left the reliefs in place as powerful images from the past that were composed into the site. The Parthian reliefs were thus neither disregarded nor were they utilized for structural purposes. They were kept in place at the entry as a continuous presence. What we can observe then is that an image world that is both ancient and Islamic makes up the realm of representation here. The gate iconography draws upon the iconographies of the past. The afterlives of ancient images were purposely integrated into the Islamic era acropolis, thus collapsing temporal boundaries. Our work as a team thus focuses on neglected histories, the archive, the skilled knowledge, the evidence of ancient restorations and preservation, the quarry, the hewing of stone, the carving of stone are all part of the larger mapping work and recognition of systems of knowledge that we have lost. The monuments and tells are part of the landscape, just as the rocks and cliffs. Tales grew around them of mythical and historical times. If we read them well, they tell us a different story about our relationship to the past. And finally, I want to say thank you to my absolutely wonderful team. You know who you are. And to the US Department of State, the US Consulate of Erbil, the Directorate General of Antiquities of Kurdistan, of Duhok, the State Board of Antiquities of Baghdad, Columbia University, Carnegie Corporation of New York, and above all, the people of Amadia. Thank you all.
Thank you for such an interesting talk, Zayab. I have a whole slew of questions in the Q&A. So can you hear me as I'm reading them out to you?
I can, yes.
Okay, so we will begin with a question from Ryan Flamini on the iconography of the reliefs of the gate. He's curious, why choose mythological dragons? Is there a large significance to making this reference in that particular culture, that time, and that place?
That's a wonderful question. That iconography also goes back to antiquity. So dragons were used for talismanic purposes, often to guard thresholds. Like we see iconography of dragons at gateways, even in Babylon. So they're often associated with guarding thresholds, guarding transitional spaces, for example. So yes, there is a very ancient tradition of an association of dragons with what we call liminal spaces, such as thresholds and transitional zones.
He follows up with a second question, and this is about the geometric patterns. Were they sacred? Do we know what significance those particular patterns had?
That's another interesting question, because the geometric pattern that what we're seeing on the arch here on the left of the screen, still visible, this is actually the tail of the dragon that has been transformed into an abstract design. And we found that really fascinating, the way that they took the figural design and then merged it into something that was absolutely abstract. Of course, abstract designs in Islamic art are commonly used, but here the combination of the figural and the abstract is actually really interesting. So I thank you for that question.
So the next question takes us to some of the details of your restoration work. And this is from Kirsten Jacobson, who thanks you and says it's a pleasure to hear you speak on your research. Her question regards your team's reconstruction of the gate. In that reconstruction, did you maintain earlier efforts of preservation, such as the Ottoman iron pins? Or did you go back to strictly traditional methods? Either way, what was the thought process in determining which time period to preserve the gate back to?
This is a question from somebody who knows preservation. Really good questions. Because yes, you have to decide what moment in time you're going to preserve. Obviously, we have to have a guideline. And as we had, our best guideline was that 1911 photograph because it was more complete. And if we wanted to restore it to, say, the 13th century, that would be a wonderful idea, but we didn't have the pictorial evidence. We didn't have, something to anchor it into if we were going to make it a 13th century gate. So that we couldn't do. We tried to restore it as much as we could to the 1911 photographs state, because we had evidence for that. Because the number one rule is you can't restore something unless you have actual empirical evidence for it. As for the iron pins, we removed the iron pins simply because leaving the iron pins in place would cause a further damage, which would lead to a collapse of the gate. So in order to stabilize the gate and to keep it safe, we had to remove the iron pins. We then had to put in new blocks. The new blocks that we used, we worked whenever possible. Our priority was to work using traditional methods and traditional materials. So we quarried the stones locally. The geologists helped us to identify the original stone quarry from where the stone came. So we tried to match the stone as closely as possible. And I think we got the same quarry in the end after doing a bit of research in the region. And so as much as possible, we tried to use traditional methods, traditional working methods, and traditional materials. But when it came to the safety and the stability of the gate, we had to remove those iron pins. Where I would say our project is different from maybe restorations that took place a few decades ago is that we didn't then discard those things. We documented them all very carefully, and we are studying them as part of the process of restoration. So we documented the whole range of historical restorations and preservation efforts through the centuries. Documenting them was part of the project as we saw it.
So Lily Caldwell asks a follow-up question. She wants to know if you could be a bit more explicit on how did emphasizing these very traditional methods of restoration help with the decolonialization aspect of your project?
Yes. Well, that's a nice question too, and I appreciate that somebody brought this up because I mean, at the very practical level, you by continuing traditional methods of building and having, for example, the elderly stonemason train a younger generation of stonemasons in traditional methods. This is a way of preserving what we call intangible heritage, right? And so this is a community-based project where the team was primarily a team that was composed of people from the neighborhood, from the region, and who were able to preserve, to not only work as a community project, but to preserve local kind of traditional craftsmanship and skilled workmanship in stone, in architectural work, that's then preserved for future generations. And then that makes it sustainable also, because it doesn't require an American team to come in each time to do the work, because they know how to do it using their own traditional techniques and materials. And as one generation teaches it to the next, this can, of course, continue.
So, a question about the local residents of Amadia. This is from Jennifer Westerfeld. She's wondering if those local residents have their own interpretations of she's interested in the Parthian reliefs, but I think we can expand it to include the gate as well. They encounter these things on a daily basis. What stories do they tell about these images?
They have so many stories. And that was really a fun part of working there, because um, people walk past it so many times a day. I mean, it's not like working on a site that's far away from people. There's a constant flow of townspeople, of people from the valley, of people from the town going back and forth several times a day. Then school groups come and so on. But with the people of the town, we stopped them, or they stopped to say hello or to see what we were doing. And we always asked them for their stories, or they volunteered their stories because they wanted to talk about the gate and the reliefs. And they told us so many. It's impossible for me to recount them here. But when we publish this project, we will definitely be including some of those stories in the scientific publication.
Oh, so you're leaving us with a cliffhanger. That's no
Yes, I
fun.
will leave you with a cliffhanger, but they're fantastic stories.
Okay, so a couple of technical or more focused questions. Peter Bangarth asks, is there any indication that the imagery had color? Because as you know, there's a lot of work on polychromy in monuments these days.
Yes, 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 yes. We looked so hard for color. We really did. We looked for color on the gate relief. And at one point we thought we had a speck, but we tested it and it was, modern acrylic, so it was left over from graffiti. Unfortunately, we didn't find any ancient color, although it may have very well have been colored at the time that it was created. The rock reliefs have been graffitied and cleaned. We were also not able to see any ancient color there. Again, it doesn't mean that they didn't have any in antiquity.
Okay. Another technical question for you from Babette Margulis. She's wondering if, as you were documenting all the stone, did you find any quarry marks, accounting marks, anything that the stonemasons were using to identify and order the blocks to assist with the creation of the gate?
Um, Well, I mean, you can see that the way that they're cut, the specific ways that they're cut and so on, but we didn't see any mason's marks. I mean, we were on the lookout for those, but we actually didn't see any mason's marks.
Okay, one more really focused technical question, and then we're going to broaden it out a bit to the politics. Martha Payne wants to know, what did you use as a binding material to hold the stones together?
Well, we used this more locally made mortar in the traditional manner, which is made up of, earth and, it's a material that's made with locally all over Iraq. So we didn't use cement or anything like that.
Okay. So, a couple of people have asked questions that focus on the political situation that comes with working in Iraq or in the Kurdistan region. Benjamin Wade asks, what is the current attitude of the Iraqi administration towards archaeology in general?
I think the current attitude in Iraq is we would like people to come and work there. I think this is what I'm hearing from everybody. They're keen to have archaeologists, heritage workers. Um, they're keen to, they would like to see people come and work on projects there. They want relations with the rest of the world to be as normal as possible. So they're actually very welcoming.
Richard Curtis asks if ISIS and their destruction of so many ancient archaeological sites had any impact in the region where you're working. Do you think this was just an area they weren't active in, or did they have a reason not to destroy this particular site?
No, I mean they thank God did not reach this particular town or city. They were in Sinjar. I mentioned the name Sinjar where I showed the comparative gate, and there as you know, there was a genocide against the Yazidi people there, as I'm sure you all know. That's a primarily Yazidi area. Here in Amedi, thank God they didn't reach here, but they were very close by in Mosul. They took over the city of Mosul, but they were contained in that area and didn't make it quite this far. So if they had come to the city, no doubt they would have also destroyed a lot, and not to mention done a great deal of harm by killing people, but also destroying monuments. But luckily, they did not make it to this city.
Well, for that, we can all be grateful. So, Riley Owen asks if you have any advice for emerging art history scholars or academics on how they can work to decolonialize their practices.
Oh, that's a really difficult question because, you know, what I say to my own students is that we can't really I mean, the idea of decolonizing archaeology is not, we may as well admit that this is not really a feasible goal because archaeology is by definition a colonial discipline because it arose at the time of the rise of colonialism. And I think that there's no way that you can time travel back in time and change that. So this is just something that we have to accept. Where we can make a difference is simply to be aware of that, to be aware that this is the history of our discipline. And when we read the sources of earlier archaeologists, especially of the 19th and the early 20th century, that we have to read them with a critical eye and read them against the grain. So my advice to emerging scholars or to students is to, when you are reading these earlier sources, read them against the grain, read them with a critical eye. Remember that many of these early archaeologists were actually colonial officers employed, you know, to do this work. So that's not going to change. What we can do is to be more aware, to be more careful with our sources. Obviously, I'm from the region, but what I would suggest is learning the languages of the region so that when you work there, you can communicate with people because that makes a world of difference. If you can communicate with people there, whether it's in Iraq, Kurdistan, Turkey, wherever, I mean, even if you're working in Greece, it doesn't matter. Wherever you choose to work, it makes a huge difference if you can speak to the people in their own language, because that already shows that you care about the living community and not just about artifacts that you want to study and take away or knowledge that you want to gather and take away. one of the other things that we've done with mapping Mesopotamia is that we've translated everything into Arabic, into Kurdish, and into Turkish, which are the three main regional languages where we work. And so everything that we've done, we've translated it into three languages. It really doesn't take that much effort. You just hire translators and they do the work, and they're happy to do it, especially if they're archaeologists or heritage preservationists from the region. They're very happy to be involved to do this work. So translation works, learning the languages, reading historical sources with a critical lens, and just having an awareness of our relationship to the site and to the local community.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I'm going to be selfish and ask you my own question. I do a lot of work on reuse in Roman architecture. And I'm wondering, you mentioned briefly the second gate that had once been there. Are there throughout the town evidence of spolia, of pieces of stone that once belonged to an older monument, um, being reused? Because
Yes.
you had already noted how creative reuse is just part of the modern culture. Do you see that in the town?
Yes, a short answer, yes. You see it everywhere. And I'm not talking about things that ought to be in a museum. I'm talking about reuse of maybe something from the 19th century in a new house. So you can see that if a 19th century or an early 20th century building collapsed, the blocks are often then reused into a newer building. Nothing is wasted. Everything is gathered up and reused. And this is something that they do now. As I said, I think that all over Iraq, they do it because of the embargo and because of decades of war and being cut off from the world. They've been forced to work this way. I mean, not work this way, but actually live this way. And they've been incredibly creative with the way that they use these things. But what's interesting is that if you look at the older material, it's clear that they were doing this in the past as well. And I think it's just a kind of the idea that you shouldn't waste good blocks or you shouldn't waste good pieces of metal, but reutilize them. So it is interesting to study this and to not to just, I mean, I'm sure that you know this given your own interest in the Roman, but not as earlier scholars would have thought of this as a kind of a mistake or as, an unfortunate thing that kind of ignorant people did in the past, but actually we should study it. This is an incredible way to learn about the way materials are utilized, the way people build, and then pieces also survive. I mean, it's a pity about that Zibari gate. I'm very curious about what happened. And right now I'm kind of digging into archives and old books to try to figure out if I can track down exactly what happened and why it was torn down, because that's a kind of a mystery.
It'll be another fascinating story. Perhaps when you've solved that mystery, you can come back for another
Happy
AIA
to.
Archaeology Hour. I would sum up, I think, about 20 million comments that say thank you, thank you, thank you from all across the United States. Um, Iraqi's history is always fascinating. Thank you, Professor. Lots of thank yous, lots of compliments. And so for those of you, if you have not yet checked out the chat, Meredith has put in there information about how to register for the March Archaeology Hour lecture with Rosemary Joyce, as well as links to other upcoming lectures and how to become a member of the AIA and support more excellent programs like this one. So thank you, everyone, for your thoughtful questions and for a fabulous talk tonight.
Thank you all very much for inviting me. Thank you.